Thank you so much, everybody, for being here tonight. This is our second in our series on religious freedom. And I want to first start off by saying a thank you to Joe and Alejandro, who brought our desserts, the homemade desserts on the end of the far end of the table. Please help yourselves. And also, Word of Mouth Catering has provided the other refreshments for us. So I want to recognize them. Our Religious Freedom series marks the Religious Freedom fortnight that the USCCB has recognized, which starts with the feast day of St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher, two martyrs for religious freedom. Their feast day is on Friday of this week. And though we may not be called to martyrdom as they were, they are models to follow in standing up for religious freedom. There are many saints today who give their lives in great courage against the forces of evil. So now, we're going to have three panels tonight. We're going to try to make it kind of quickly. After the first panel, we're going to take a little break, and that's another an opportunity for you to take some refreshments in the back. Our first two speakers are Hillary Byrnes and Aaron Matthew Weldon. They're from the USCCB's Religious Liberty Program, both of which were here last year. And they're going to update us on the developments in religious freedom, in threats against religious freedom and conscience, and also in what USCCB is doing. Hillary is the Director of Religious Liberty and Associate General Counsel for the USCCB. She staffs the Committee for Religious Liberty, which the U.S. bishops established to address growing concerns over the erosion of freedom of religion in America. She also focuses on legal issues affecting Catholic education in the United States. Hillary is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame Law School, cum laude. Before law school, she earned her B.S. in Foreign Service, magna cum laude, from Georgetown University. She has discussed religious liberty topics in speeches on radio and television and in print media. And she also serves as Secretary of the Catholic Bar Association, a community of legal professionals that educates and organizes and inspires its members to faithfully uphold and bear witness to the Catholic faith in the study and practice of law. Aaron Matthew Weldon, also with the Religious Liberty Program, is a Religious Liberty Program Specialist at USCCB. His work focuses on educating Catholics about religious freedom. He frequently contributes to the God's Servant First blog, and he is a host of the USCCB First Freedom podcast. If you haven't had a chance to listen to them, you should listen to them on their. You can find them on the USCCB website. Our first speaker last week was also interviewed and is featured on one of the podcasts. That was Jennifer Bryson. Thank you so much. Aaron received a Ph.D. in systematic theology from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and he is a Master's of Divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary and a Bachelor's of Science in Biomedical Engineering from Texas A&M University. Please welcome Hillary Byrnes and Aaron Matthew Weldon.
So, thank you for inviting me, Monica, to join the panel today. I'm happy for the opportunity to return to St. Patrick's. It was a great time last year coming, so I'm glad to get to do this again. So our speakers this evening are mostly going to be talking about particular religious freedom issues. I want to begin our conversation by saying something about why the church promotes religious freedom at all. Certainly here in the United States, the bishops are concerned about Catholic institutions. But the promotion of religious freedom is not a matter of just of self-interest. In fact, the church teaches that religious freedom is a fundamental human right and that it is essential to the common good. So this is one reason that we, in our promotion of religious freedom, that's religious freedom for all people. Certainly we focus on Catholic institutions, but we want to promote religious freedom for all. Now this is obviously a huge, huge topic to try to get into when I only have about 10 minutes. So we'll do our best. But I will say with a couple of things that what I'm going to talk about, Monica mentioned the First Freedom podcast. On episode 26 of that podcast, I interviewed a very good friend of mine, Barrett Turner, who is like one of the top experts on Catholic social teaching, and specifically on religious liberty. So definitely, if you're interested in anything I have to say this evening, go there for something that's much more in-depth than what I'm going to be able to do. So I'm going to discuss briefly 3 main points: the dignity of the human person, the nature of faith itself, and church and state, what the church teaches about the state. Obviously, again, we're just barely skimming the surface, but we'll do what we can. So before we can even think about religious freedom itself, we have to understand some things about the church's teaching on the human person. As Dignitatis Humanae teaches, Dignitatis Humanae is the church's document from Vatican II on religious freedom. Specifically says the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the dignity of the human person. So this is what and in fact, Dignitatis Humanae literally means of human dignity. So this is really the basis of church teaching on religious freedom, dignity of the human person. So let me say 2 things about the human person. Obviously, there's much more that could be said, but a couple of things. First, in that first quote from Fides et Ratio, encyclical of St. John Paul II, very succinctly, is the nature of the human being to seek the truth. So we're fundamentally truth seekers. Human beings have a natural desire to know the truth about religious questions. There's this desire to know where do we come from, what happens when we die, how do I know that I lived a good life, what do I owe the Creator. All these sorts of questions are implanted in us by nature. So now, obviously, when we're dominated by distractions, or if we become habituated to a shallow life, we may kind of forget about some of those types of questions. But it's still, this is something that's implanted in our very being. And so in that sense, it's human to pursue the answers to these questions and then live out the truth that we grasp. The second point, the human person is social, and as a corollary to that is political. So I have this quote from Gaudium et Spes, another document from the Second Vatican Council. I'm actually, this little bit, I'm going to go further on the passage that it's drawn from later on. We talk about church and state because it has so much to it. As it says, men, family, and various groups which make up civil community are aware they cannot achieve a truly human life by their own unaided efforts. This is to say we're social beings. We belong to families, neighborhoods, communities. We cannot flourish in isolation from others. This is just fundamental to our human nature. The good life for an individual will necessarily be a life lived in communion with others. Moreover, we're political, and you kind of get this when it mentions this in this quote. For this purpose, because we're social, we set up a political community according to various forms. I mean, you could really do a lot just with this one little bit, but a corollary to our social nature is that human beings must work out how to order a common life that fosters the good of the community as a whole. So again, this point will become clear when we talk about church and state, but just wanted to at least raise it here at the outset. So basic points of theological anthropology: human person is oriented to truth, we're social and political. Let me say a little bit about the nature of faith itself. You'll recognize that is Cardinal Wojtyła before he was St. John Paul II. He's actually at the Second Vatican Council. If you know, he was instrumental in the drafting of Dignitatis Humanae. So I just thought that was a fun picture of him with his shades at the council itself. But as you see, the quote itself points out, the act of faith is of its very nature a free act. In some ways, this is just kind of common sense if you think about what faith itself is, that it has to be a free response. It can't be, by its very nature, it cannot be coerced. Certainly, a person could be coerced into giving an outward profession of faith to which he or she does not give an internal assent. But in that sense, the person is simply saying an untruth. I mean, you could even say that they're lying in a sense. So, I mean, you could, kind of, one way to say it is that a government that attempts to coerce faith is going to produce either liars or martyrs, basically. But you're not going to actually coerce real faith. I think that's something that's obvious in some ways. But also, as I've implied, something else about the nature of faith is that it's something that has to be embodied. And I think this is important with some of the religious liberty challenges we face today, because sometimes you'll hear, or at least I will see in different writings, that this idea that religious liberty wasn't violated when somebody was forced to do something that they didn't believe, because they can still believe whatever they want, which doesn't really make any sense. The nature of faith is that it's something that's lived out. It's not something that's just in the mind. These are very basic points, but still it's important to raise them up. Now finally, church teaching about the nature of the state. And we're going to continue. This quote is just the continuation of that Gaudium et Spes quote that I had a few slides earlier. So we'll just we're just going to work our way through this passage because it's really, it's very interesting and helpful. So as it says, the political community exists for the sake of the common good, in which it finds its full justification, significance, and the source of its inherent legitimacy. Indeed, the common good embraces the sum of those conditions of the social life whereby men, family, and associations can attain their own perfection. In other words, to make it less abstract, I think, when you talk about the common good, that's about the conditions necessary for human flourishing, I think it's helpful to be more concrete and think about maybe like a specific institution. So, for example, think about a school, a common project. The school has a purpose to provide education to young people in a community. And the school is able to achieve that purpose when certain conditions are in place. For example, if the kids are physically healthy, if the building is in decent shape, the teachers have to have been trained, if the families from which the kids come need to value education. These are all conditions that are necessary for the flourishing of that institution. Likewise, a political community as a whole, there are certain conditions need to be in place in order for everybody to, in order for the community as a whole to thrive. So let's keep on going. Yet the people who come together in the political community are many and diverse. They have every right to prefer divergent solutions. I think any of us who's worked in a committee or tried to do any sort of project knows that the opinions are many and diverse on how people want to proceed on a common project. So if the political community is going to not be torn apart, there must be an authority to direct the energies of the citizens. Oops. In other words, just to sum it up very quickly, the church teaches that the state should foster the conditions in which its citizens can flourish. That is, the public authority is responsible for promoting the common good. This is just basic Catholic social teaching. I bring up the final part of the passage, though, just to note that it says that the political community and public authority are founded on human nature. Sometimes there's a tendency to think of politics as being like a result of the fall, or it's about the need to dominate, or things like that. But in Catholic social teaching, it's an aspect of human nature, and there's this, and you can see just as we briefly went over this idea that the purpose of it is to promote the common good, for people to work out how to work towards the common good. This is basic teaching about the common good and the role of the state in doing that. And now I think the pieces start to fall into place. Because first, obviously, as I said about faith, the state cannot compel people to believe if the nature of faith doesn't allow for that. But more importantly, the state, to the extent possible, is to ensure that its citizens are able to pursue the truth about God and to respond to that truth. And this is why religious liberty is a part of the common good. And this must be true not only for individuals, but as I said, we're social beings. So it has to be true for groups and institutions. Again, faith is not an interior matter. So if people are going to pursue the truth about God and live in accordance with that truth, the freedom has to be in place for people to actually live out that truth. Now, I'll just point out one interesting little bit from Dignitatis Humanae that I think is worth, it's more of like food for thought, not really, it's not, I just give it to you, something to kind of take home, or maybe if you want to discuss it, it could be something that could be discussed. The state should not simply permit, but actually foster religion in Catholic teaching. This is an interesting thing to think about, like what this means for us. For example, Dignitatis Humanae specifically says, I didn't put this in the slide, but I'll just read the quote, "The religious acts whereby men in private and public, out of a sense of personal conviction, direct their lives to God, transcend by their very nature the order of temporal affairs. Government, therefore, ought indeed to take account of the religious life of the citizenry and show it favor, since the function of the government is to make provision for the common welfare." I just think it raises interesting questions for us when we have a tradition of non-establishment in our country. What it means then to promote, what does it mean to foster the religious life of the citizenry? What are we as Catholics, what are we responsible for in this regard? So I simply just note that and then kind of step away and not offer any of my own thoughts, but just to say that this is an interesting part of church teaching that's helpful to think about. Finally, I mostly focused on the issue of human dignity, the nature of the human person, because this is what's central to the document Dignitatis Humanae, which is more like recent Catholic teaching on religious liberty. A core teaching about religious freedom is that the church must be free to engage in her mission. This is called the freedom of the church, or libertas ecclesiae in Latin, long-standing understanding of the church that the church should not be impeded or should not be prevented from carrying out her mission. Now, many of our current efforts, indeed, we want to promote religious freedom for all, but in terms of kind of how our division of labor works, is we're often focused on ensuring that our institutions can, in fact, continue to carry out the mission of the church here in the United States. And so, to kind of transition to Hillary's talk, much of our efforts are involved in trying to continue to ensure that we have freedom to serve. So this year for Religious Freedom Week, we produced a short video that kind of draws attention to some of these efforts. So I will show the video now, and then I will hand it to Hillary to then talk about some of the things that were actually current threats to religious liberty that we're dealing with.
One in 5 Americans is Catholic. Catholics work to contribute to the common good of our society, serving in many areas. 1 out of 6 hospital beds in the U.S. is in a Catholic hospital. The Catholic Church has settled 20 to 25% of the refugees admitted to the U.S. over the past few years. The Church provides quality education for millions of Americans. Catholics provide housing and care to women facing unexpected pregnancies, feed and clothe the poor, and serve men and women suffering drug addiction. Catholics come from all walks of life and seek to live their faith, not only at Mass, but at home, school, work, and in public life. In the face of our country's challenges and challenges within the Church herself, Catholics find strength in the hope of Jesus Christ and desire to share that hope with everyone. Our Christian faith compels us to reach out beyond our church walls, to love our neighbors by working to strengthen our neighborhoods, cities, and communities. For Catholics to continue to be able to contribute to our country, religious freedom is vital, and religious freedom gives us the space to carry out the mission that Jesus has entrusted to the Church. Religious freedom means that Catholics and all people of goodwill are free to seek the truth and to live in accordance with that truth, and so to strengthen our common life as a nation. Beginning June 22nd, the feast of Saints Thomas More and John Fisher, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops celebrates Religious Freedom Week. In the midst of our current challenges, join us as we seek the kingdom and find strength in hope.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Erin, for providing us with an overview of church teaching on religious liberty. And I know if you had an hour, you could certainly fill all that time, discussing the various documents through which we learn about church teaching on religious liberty. So now that we have that overview, I'd like to get into some of the practical application of that teaching, at least as applies here in the U.S. And I know our later speakers are going to get into international religious freedom issues. So definitely looking forward to that. My goal here, I know Maya is here from the Department of Health and Human Services, so she's going to talk about some of the goings on at HHS. My goal is to introduce you to some of the other religious freedom challenges that we have here in the U.S., and some issues that you may not have heard about yet. So, here we go. I will skip through the outline because I know that we're pretty short on time, so I want to make sure that we just jump right into the first issue, which is something that is fairly personal to me because it came up during the confirmation hearings for one of my favorite professors, Professor Amy Barrett at Notre Dame Law School. And she's a highly regarded professor. She clerked on the U.S. Supreme Court, and no one really questioned her ability to serve as a federal judge when she was nominated a couple of years ago to serve in that capacity. What they did question was Amy Barrett's Catholic faith. So she is a mother of 7, and she's a devout Catholic. So during her confirmation hearings in September of 2017 before the U.S. Senate, multiple senators interrogated her about her faith, with one senator asking her derisively if she considered herself an Orthodox Catholic. And then in an exchange with Senator Dianne Feinstein that went viral, and it's now been plastered on T-shirts and coffee mugs. Erin and I have our own coffee mugs with this. Senator Feinstein told Barrett, quote, "The dogma lives loudly within you." Well, I hope that all of us can live out our Catholic faith in such a way that would lead someone to tell us the dogma lives loudly within you. So I hope we can be inspired by that quote, which was meant in a totally different way. But so I'd like to ask all of you next, how many of you are now or have you ever been a member of the Knights of Columbus? I know my husband is, and okay, I see a few of you. Well, did you know that if you're interested in serving in public office, that your Knights membership might disqualify you? Well, if some senators in the U.S. Senate have their way, it would be a bar to public office. So you see several nominees in the last year or so have been questioned by senators about their belonging to the Knights of Columbus of all organizations, and whether they would renounce such membership if they were confirmed as federal judges. And this is because the Knights uphold the Catholic Church's teaching on the sanctity of marriage and the sanctity of human life. So the USCCB has been actively opposed to this kind of questioning. The conference has done several statements explaining why this is wrong, and this is actually unconstitutional under the Constitution's prohibition on religious tests for public office. So we're encouraging our grassroots to tell their senators to please reject such tests. It seems kind of basic, but unfortunately we have to tell our senators how to do their jobs and follow the Constitution and not ask such questions. So the next couple of cases I'd like to talk about have to do with the freedom to live out one's faith in daily life. And specifically, they concern the freedom of creative professionals to be able to use their artistic skills in a way that glorifies God. So a man named Jack Phillips is a Christian who owns Masterpiece Cake Shop, which is right outside of Denver. So he's more than just a baker. He creates award-winning cakes, cake designs for special occasions. What he does not do is he doesn't use his God-given talents to create things that go against his beliefs. So, for example, he's turned down orders for cakes with pornographic type themes for bachelor or bachelorette parties. He doesn't do Halloween themed designs, and he's even turned down a cake order for a cake celebrating a divorce. So when two men approached him about creating a custom wedding cake to celebrate their same-sex wedding reception, Mr. Phillips politely declined the order, but he told them he'd sell them any other item available in the store, such as cupcakes or brownies. Well, what did the two men do next? Well, they filed a complaint with the state of Colorado, and the Colorado Civil Rights Commission ruled against Mr. Phillips and his cake shop. So the court actually ordered Mr. Phillips and his staff to create custom cakes for same-sex celebrations. They also ordered him to comply with the state law by re-educating his staff and filing quarterly compliance reports for 2 years. So he ended up appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, in June of last year, as many of you may have heard, the Supreme Court thankfully reversed these bad lower court decisions in a 7-2 opinion in favor of Masterpiece Cake Shop. And they held that the conduct of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, when it was evaluating Jack Phillips' reasons for declining to make that cake, that the conduct of the commissioners, they found, violated the free exercise clause of the U.S. Constitution. What they said was Phillips was not treated neutrally by that commission because some of the members were just completely hostile to him. They compared his beliefs to the Nazis and the Holocaust. I mean, it was really pretty insane. But unfortunately, despite this victory at the U.S. Supreme Court last year, Jack Phillips is still not done with the legal system. So last year, the Colorado Civil Rights Commission went after him again because he declined to create a gender transition cake for a customer who wanted a cake to be blue on the outside and pink on the inside in order to show that customer's transition from male to female. So I can't make this stuff up. The state of Colorado thankfully dropped its prosecution of Jack Phillips earlier this year. But just last week, I believe it was, the customer has now sued Phillips. So that's the third lawsuit this poor guy has faced. So he continues to be in the courts. Another prominent case in the area of creative professionals involves a woman named Byrnes Stutzman, and she is a Christian florist in the state of Washington, and she declined to create floral arrangements for the wedding of a customer that was in a same-sex relationship. She had served this particular customer for almost 10 years, but she told him her Christian faith would not allow her to create custom floral arrangements for his wedding. Well, what happened next was that the state of Washington and the ACLU sued on behalf of the customer and his partner. And similarly to Jack Phillips, the state courts ruled against Ms. Stutzman, and they even went a step further and imposed what's called personal liability on her. So Byrnes could lose not only her business, but also her home, her other personal property, including her 401k. She could be completely bankrupted by this litigation. So the U.S. Supreme Court last year, after it decided the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, they sent Ms. Stutzman's case back to the Washington Supreme Court, and unfortunately, On June 6th, this month, the Washington Supreme Court ruled against Ms. Stutzman a second time, so she's now going to go back up to the U.S. Supreme Court to once again hear her case. And then this is a complete change of gears from flowers to parking lots, but this is another religious freedom issue that the USCCB is very concerned about, and it's a little known provision in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 that imposes a new tax on parking and transit benefits provided by nonprofit organizations, including churches. So not only does this impose a new tax on nonprofits, it also requires them to hire accountants and try to figure out how much they owe. A lot of the time the amount of hiring the accountants is actually way more than the tax itself. So, and then unfortunately, it's going to end up entangling the IRS with houses of worship. So for the first time ever, thousands of houses of worship around the country are having to file this Form 990T, which then their tax return ends up being made publicly available. And it's just a really big intrusion between church and state. So there is, thankfully, bipartisan support for repealing this new tax. So we're asking our grassroots to contact Congress to support something called the Lift for Charities Act. It's a bill that would fix this problem. So that's something we're really concerned about. The next issue I'll discuss really briefly is one that's happening more at the state level than the federal level, and it involves state attempts to force priests to violate the seal of confession. And as we know, this is one of the most sacred of Catholic beliefs, and we all rely on this guarantee that priests are not going to tell anyone what we say in confession. And a priest, actually under canon law, if they break the seal, they're automatically excommunicated. So it's a really serious thing for the Catholic Church. But the California legislature does not really care, and they are debating a bill that would propose to eliminate this penitential communication exemption when it comes to child sexual abuse. And really this, the California Catholic Conference has put out a lot of materials explaining why this is a blatant violation of religious liberty, and it's really kind of a solution in search of a problem because there's no evidence that any child sexual abuse would be stopped by forcing priests to divulge what people tell them in the confessional. We have no evidence that it's going to prevent any actual crimes from occurring. Another area where we've seen threats to the church is in adoption and foster care services, and attempts by states, and some of these attempts have been successful, to stop Catholic Charities agencies from continuing to serve children through adoption and foster care services because our faith compels us to place children in homes headed by a married mom and dad. And unfortunately, there are sexual orientation non-discrimination laws that would force Catholic Charities agencies to shut their doors. And this has already happened in places like Illinois, Massachusetts, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. And this is really just such a terrible tragedy for the children themselves, because these Catholic Charities agencies have served their local communities for sometimes over 100 years, and they have the expertise to serve children with disabilities and other special needs. And now there are just fewer agencies to serve these children because they've been basically kicked out of being able to serve. To prevent this from happening, we have seen states pass laws that would protect the conscience rights of adoption and foster care agencies. But we really need a federal remedy to this, and that's why the USCCB is supporting a bill called the Child Welfare Provider Inclusion Act. It's a long name, but we call it the Inclusion Act, and that would provide a remedy to this by telling states not to discriminate against Catholic charities and other faith-based agencies. And thankfully, the versions of the Inclusion Act have now passed in at least 9 states. So at least we're on a roll at the state level, but we still need federal relief. And then I'm going to skip through these next couple slides because I know that we're running out of time, but just to be aware that in places like Michigan and Philadelphia, unfortunately, we are seeing attempts by state and local governments to continue discriminating against Catholic charities, foster care and adoption agencies, and we are fighting back with litigation. So but that brings us to what can all of us do. Of course, we can educate ourselves about religious freedom by going to the USCCB's website, usccb.org/freedom. You can learn about all these different issues, some of the legislation that I talked about. You can go to the Take Action tab and contact Congress to support legislation that would help preserve religious freedom. You can also sign up for Free to Serve, our monthly e-newsletter, and then you can follow us on Twitter at USCCB Freedom. You can also check out the God's Servant First blog and the First Freedom podcast that Aaron mentioned. And finally, you can get text message alerts on breaking religious freedom issues by texting the word freedom to the number 84576. And that information's all on our website. So if you forgot the numbers, they're on there. So with that, I think we have like maybe 1 or 2 minutes to take a question or two. So we're happy to do that at this point. Yes, sir.
Well, actually, there's a two-part question. One dealing with the situation, modern situation, and do you think what you said is great, but how many Catholics in that church on a Sunday know anything about what you just said? I mean, about the documents of Vatican II, what St. John Paul has written, and yet we never hear it. I never hear it from the pulpit, and there's a reason why I want to go back my first part later, why, I'm concerned with things you don't hear from that pulpit, among these things, questions like this.
I don't know that I could speak to why priests often aren't inclined to preach on some of these issues. Oh, bishops, yeah. I do know that you're right in terms of the lack of people not being very informed about these sorts of things. There was a guy at CUA did a survey of what people's knowledge of Catholic social teaching and asked them to do you know what the common good is, and then can you then say what it is? And most people think they know what it is, and then what they say it is not at all what the Catholic Church actually teaches that it is. In terms of why, we try to do our part, but in terms of amplifying the message, I'm not really sure I could say why there's kind of some reticence sometimes to preach about these sorts of issues. But I don't know if you have any
I'll just
insight.
say that I think it's a perfect plug for Religious Freedom Week and looking at the materials. And I mean, this is really, it's kind of a newer issue for the bishops to be involved in, to be quite honest. I think we probably all got complacent about the issue for many, many years. And the HHS contraceptive mandate was really something that I think captured attention from a lot of people, that, hey, our religious liberty, we shouldn't take it for granted in this country. Yes, we don't have the kinds of threats that we face, that people around the world face, as far as, hopefully you're not going to be killed for your faith in the U.S., but you could lose your job. You could lose, like Baronelle Stutzman, she could lose her house, because of a lawsuit against her for one decision that she made for an order that she didn't feel under her Christian faith that she could comply with. So I think it's something that we are continuing to try to raise awareness about, because we don't want to take it for granted. So let's celebrate Religious Freedom Week, June 22nd to 29th.
And the second part was now I go back to the 30s, in Germany. I was born in Berlin, 1933. I was a Jew. So, a lot of times it comes up what happened to the Jewish people in Germany could even begin to happen in a country that's 100% Christian. Okay? Were people ever educated, about religious freedom and about, that everybody has a right to religious freedom by the bishops? They keep quiet. Now there were many priests and some bishops, but many priests and nuns who did speak out, and you know where they wound up. Okay? And unfortunately, the people today or later blame Pius XII because he did more than most of the Jews in America did for the Jews over there. Okay, and when people today, accuse somebody, like maybe the president, of being a Hitler, these guys don't have the slightest idea what the heck they're talking about. They've never lived under that. You know what I mean? They just throw the term out. The Holocaust, it's not a Holocaust. It may be, many times I've talked about the Holocaust of abortion, and I'm told I shouldn't compare abortion to the Holocaust. I'm sorry, I lived there, I was under it, and half my family got killed in concentration camps. I will talk about abortion, but that's, so that goes back to today, I guess. But it wasn't done, and yet the teachings of the church, even though Vatican II was 1962, 63, that didn't start new then. It goes way back. So it should have been done even in Germany by bishops in that time. Not the Pope, the bishops in Germany.
I think another question here and then we'll
I may be getting a little bit off topic, but I just want to point out that, you're talking about the church promoting religious freedom, that definitely hasn't always been the case. If you go back to the early history of the church with all the heresies, like the Albigensian heresy, they definitely did not tolerate these things, and also later on with the Crusades. So this is very, very recent, in the history of the church.
So I encourage you to listen to the podcast. The guy, Barrett Turner, his dissertation was on this very topic he was looking at development of doctrine and Catholic social teaching using religious liberty as a test case. I don't know, that's, like I said, it's such a huge topic, like how that doctrine developed over time. But definitely, so check out the podcast. He's the guy that I had on there, Barrett Turner, is the absolute expert on this topic. So because it's a very good question. Yeah.
Thankfully, we are on the same page, and I thank you so much, Hillary and Aaron, for